We've got a few people still coming back in, so I think everyone's coming. So my name's Karen Brundage. I'm a nurse practitioner. Just a little bit about myself. I started my career in Maryland, actually in primary care, and quickly went back to as a nurse practitioner, and quickly went back to my love of hematology oncology. And so I was at Seattle Children's for many years. That's where I met Dr. Akiko Shimomura and got to work with her in Seattle. And then when she moved to Boston, I had left my job in Seattle and she offered me a position there. And so I came to Boston and I've been at Boston Children's now for 9.5 years. And for the last 3 years, I've been working with the registry and doing some research work as a nurse practitioner. But I have a lot of, as she mentioned, a lot of clinical experience. So I'm the person who sees children in the clinic for their visits. I order their labs. I order their GCSF. I perform the bone marrow procedures. So I kind of do all of that type of stuff. So I have a lot of practical knowledge about taking care of people with neutropenia, both cancer patients with neutropenia and children with blood disorders and congenital and acquired neutropenia. So happy to chat with you all. I'll be here all the way through tomorrow. I don't get to stay for the baseball game, unfortunately, but I'll be here all the way through tomorrow afternoon. And so if people have questions about GCSF or about neutropenia or about taking care of yourselves and your children to live healthy and well with neutropenia, I'd be happy to chat with you. I will be the first to admit that I do not have the experience of Adriana Bolliard, who many of you know and have worked with, but she is on my speed dial. And I do try to be conscious because on the East Coast, of course, we have a different time zone change. So I'm really careful not to call her too early in the morning. But we do chat a lot. And so there's times, especially with adult patients, because I'm mostly a pediatric nurse practitioner, there's times with adult patients, they have questions and I call her up and we talk and she's been able to give me a lot of useful information. So I hope that you'll help to take advantage of that. Again, in the registry, a lot of my families will be like, can you just call my doctor and tell them this or that? And we can't do that, unfortunately, insert ourselves in the care with your physicians. But we're happy to talk to you and give you ideas of questions to ask your physicians or give you articles to share with them. And we're always happy to have the physicians call and speak with us or with our doctors. And so we encourage you to let them know that we're very available if they have questions, because patients with neutropenia, as many of you I'm sure have already figured out and know, it's different than people who have neutropenia from chemotherapy. And frequently what happens is the doctors want to do things that work in their patients with chemotherapy and cancer and leukemia, and it doesn't quite work the same when you have other neutropenia conditions. I was asked to talk about biosimilars, and I think a lot of this came up because of those of you who especially have been on the registry and are getting Neupogen through the Amgen program that was originally part of the registry in Seattle. There's been back orders of different types of Neupogen products and GCSF products over the last year, which has been, I think, harrowing for families and for patients. You know, I've had families stockpiling GCSF. I've had families knowing that it's a single-use vial, but trying to take multiple doses out of a vial. And so we just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the biosimilars. How many of you are on GCSF or have a family member on GCSF? So many of you can relate to this. Okay. And then how many of you are on Neupogen? Okay, many. Okay. How many of you are on Zarxio? Is anybody on Zarxio? Okay. Is another one or two? Anybody on Nivastim? I have Nivastim. I have a lot of people on Nivastim right now at Boston Children's. Okay. And anyone on Reluco? No. That's okay. That one was just more recently approved. So when we think about the different medications, so as Dr. Dales shared about, GCSF is really interesting because it's what's called a biologic. So it's not a chemically made. It's not a chemical. It's not just made like Tylenol or ibuprofen or something like that. It actually is made by a living organism, by a bacteria. And so the bacteria, what they do is they insert the human gene for GCSF that he was talking about. They take that human gene and they insert it into the genome of the bacteria. And the bacteria then multiply and ferment, and they actually make GCSF just because that's what they do. And we have bacteria make lots of different medications for us, which is great. And so those of you, I think, especially when I'm driven back and forth across the country from Seattle to Boston, I'm always amazed at the homeland around the country. And I go by, literally hours of corn or hours of wheat or hours of other, alfalfa. And so really they get all these bacteria and then they harvest them just like we harvest our crops. And then they extract the GCSF from the bacteria and they purify it and then they put it into the right concentration and then put in those little vials or syringes that you get. And so it's a kind of a complicated process. And so Neupogen has been around for a long time, But fortunately now there are other biosimilars. And what's great about biosimilars is that many of them are less expensive than Neupogen. Now, those of you who get the Neupogen on the Amgen program don't usually have to worry about the cost or the copay, but many patients who are on Neupogen who aren't on that program or on GCSF not on that program do have copays, and they can be significant out-of-pocket expenses for these types of medications, because these little vials can cost $200 to $400 per vial, which is a little mind-boggling when you think about it. I had a family when I was in Seattle once who had accepted delivery of a box of GCSF for a month, and there was miscommunication between the mom and dad, and it got left out on the porch in Seattle for more than 2 days in the summer, and it was expired and not able to be used. And the insurance company didn't want to pay for it to be replaced because it was thousands and thousands of dollars. And we eventually did talk them into it because it was a one-time thing, and the family promised they would be really careful in the future. And the insurance company eventually did cover it, but it can be really expensive medication. So what's interesting about the biosimilars is that they're not generic. So when those of you think about generic medications, again, when I go to CVS or Walgreens, and I don't always care about buying Tylenol brand, I'm happy to buy acetaminophen, right? Or I don't need Motrin or Advil, I'm happy to buy ibuprofen. So I get a generic medication. But the biosimilars aren't really generics in the same way because it's not a chemical compound. It's actually a biologic. It's being made by a living organism, by a bacteria. And so each of the brands are slightly different. But what's important about it is that even though they're slightly different, they've been tested and vetted and gone through an FDA process for those of you who are in the United States and using FDA-approved medications to show that they have similar efficacy and similar side effects. And so I think sometimes families get worried about that. They're like, oh, I've been on Neupogen for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and now all of a sudden, because of a back order or because my insurance has changed or something's happened, they want me to switch to a different biosimilar, to switch from Neupogen to Nivastim or to Granix or to Zarxio or Releuko. And is that okay? And it is okay. Most patients do very well on all forms of GCSF. They really do. I can think of one patient that I've worked with in my 30 years taking care of patients on GCSF who really seemed to be more brand specific. And we were able to make a case with their insurance company for that. But I have some patients who literally every year, either because the family's insurance changes, one of the parents, whoever has their insurance, changes companies, or the company themselves, the company that they work for changes who they have different formulary agreements with for their human resources and for their medical health plans, they have to change it. And so frequently every year I will get a bunch of messages in my inbox saying, you've been, filling Nivastim for this patient for the last 2 years, but now all of a sudden that's not on formulary anymore. It's not covered by their insurance anymore. So then you have to go through the process of switching them to the next one. And I've had one little boy go from Neupogen to Nivastim to Neupogen to Nivastim in the 7 years that I've taken care of him. And he's done fine. And the parents, we've not seen any difference in the blood counts. We've not seen any difference in the side effects. The medications are all the same concentration, the same dose that you draw up. And so I just wanted to reassure you that those medications are actually very safe. The first biosimilar that was ever approved in the United States was actually a GCSF medication. It was Zarxio. So in 2015, it was the very first biosimilar in the US that was approved. And since then, there's been about, I think it's over 70 or 75 biosimilars currently in the United States. Again, very different than generics. These are things that are made biologic organisms like bacteria that have been approved. And so the ones that have been approved are the Zarxio, the Nivastim, and the Releuko. And then again, some of you might be on Granix. Granix isn't considered a biosimilar because it was actually approved by the FDA before the biosimilar program even opened in 2015. So again, it's the same type of medication. It's just not considered a biosimilar, but it is another GCSF product. So when we think about recalls, like why do recalls happen? And those of you who have been on the side of having problems with the Neupogen through the Amgen program, I know it's been very frustrating. Both Audrey and I have spent time calling and talking to Nipper RX, which is the specialty pharmacy that the Amgen program uses to dispense the Neupogen to patients on that Amgen program. So we've called them, and they also are frustrated because they're not getting answers from Amgen. Then we call Amgen, and we don't necessarily get answers, and they don't always share what's going on. But things can happen. Again, when you think about a medication like this that's made from a bacteria, that's made a biologic, not just a chemical compound that's made in a lab, there's a lot of different points where you can have problems. And so there's testing that's done throughout the production process. And so sometimes as they're producing a product and they're testing it in the different phases to make sure that it's efficacious and it's safe and there's no contamination in the line, they could find something that's wrong with it. And if that happens, it could delay a whole batch being released. Sometimes what happens is a lot of these medications all of the processes of these medications aren't done in the United States. They're actually done in other countries. And so then, sometimes during COVID, there are issues. Sometimes there's supply chain issues. Sometimes I think in the future, we're going to see problems with some of the tariffs, honestly, causing issues when some of these portions of how these drugs are made come from other countries, it might affect how we're getting them. So that becomes part of an issue. And then sometimes once the medications have actually been released, they've been actually, distributed to hospitals or pharmacies to patients. Sometimes then they find out in testing that they're continuing to do on those product lines that maybe that product doesn't stay as efficacious as long as they want to. So for instance, like Neupogen and Granix, they expect that once they release that bottle or that syringe, that it's still going to be as efficacious 12, 24, 36 months after they release it compared to the day that it goes off the shelf. And so that was the most recent issue that came with one of the recalls on the Granix recall, is that they were saying that it wasn't going to last for 36 months. Now, most patients weren't waiting 36 months to use their supply, and most hospitals weren't. They were using it up before then, but there was a recall, and they wanted people, especially it was pharmacy size doses that they were recalling. And so they asked that they send back those vials. And again, it wasn't that it wasn't effective. It wasn't that it wasn't safe. It was that the concern was that it wouldn't be effective 3 years from now if people still had it on their shelf. So there can be lots of different reasons that drugs get recalled. And again, it's not always transparent, I think, to us in the medical field or to consumers why that's occurred and why that's going on. So again, people frequently were calling. We had a lot of phone calls during the VAC order for the Neupogen earlier in this year. There was 2 different phases that there were problems, and we got a lot of different phone calls. What do you know? What do you know? And I actually don't know as much probably as you all do because again, we're not the ones who manufacture it and we're not the ones who distribute it. But again, I was able to get on the phone and talk to people at Niporex and talk to people at Amgen and get as much information as I could. I think the biggest question for a lot of us is what's the timeline? When is it going to become available again? And that was the piece of information that really seemed to be lacking, unfortunately. How many of you had problems during that time with medication? Okay, yeah, it was a significant amount of people, and I talked to families that I knew that were either trying to space out. They're like, well, I usually give it 3 times a week. I'm trying to just do it twice a week. Or again, a lot of people who are going into the vials more than once. I have some families who have more than one person in the household who are affected, and so they were drawing up all family members from one vial instead of each family using their own vial, for instance. So there is different things that people have done, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Any questions about that right now? I know there'll be time for questions, answers later, but does anyone have questions about the biosimilars and how they're formulated? And yep. Is it fine to go between Neupogen and Zarxio? It is, yeah. So I mean, again, I would prefer you not like go back and forth every week. So usually most patients have a block of medication that they are taking for months or a year before they would have to switch, but you can very easily switch from one to the other. So. And I do have patients who have switched from one to the other annually, sometimes depending on their insurance or what their formulary is with their insurance. If you do run into a problem, so again, some of you are fortunate to be on the Amgen program and are grandfathered into that program. We just want to remind you that you do need to fill your prescription once a year. Now, some of you are on that medication daily or weekly, and you're like, well, of course I'll keep filling it. But other patients I know use it just at times when they're not feeling well or sick or traveling. And so for those of you, especially who use it intermittently, please make sure that if you're on that program that you fill it once a year. That's really important because Amgen has said that as long as you continue to fill it, and again, it's their program, it has nothing to do with us. We don't run the program. We don't manage it. We don't maintain it. It's their program, but they've said that as long as patients fill the prescription once a year, that they will continue to honor that. And their commitment right now is to keep that program open, which I think is amazing because there are several hundred patients on that program. And so that's their commitment, is to do that. So, but they've also said that if you don't fill it every year, it's possible that you could be dropped from the program. And if you get dropped from the program, it doesn't exist anymore. It stopped accruing a few years before the registry even closed in Seattle. And so there's been no new accruals for about 4 or 5 years on that program. And there is going to be no more new accruals on that program because it closed before Seattle closed. And so please, if you're on that program, continue to fill it at least once a year because it's a great benefit because you're not having to pay copays. And copays really differ for the GCSF products and for your insurance. And a lot of it really comes down to your insurance program and what you have. So I have many families who get their GCSF product not on the Neupogen program. They just get it through their normal prescription insurance. And many of them pay no money for their GCSF. And frequently, if there's a good reason for you to be on it, and hopefully if your doctor's prescribing it, there's a reason for you to be on it, they can write what's called a letter of medical necessity to really explain to your insurance why you need to be on it and why it needs to be covered. And so, but again, everyone has different coverages in their insurance as far as how much their copay is for medication and different tiers of medication. GCSF tends to be a higher tier of medication because it's a very expensive drug. And so sometimes, for instance, some people might have $0 for something that's like a Tylenol or Claritin, but it might be $10, $20, $25 for something like a GCSF product every month. And then a lot of people have what's called an out-of-pocket maximum for the year. So, and that doesn't always apply to your prescription insurance. So again, look at the fine print in your insurance policies, because sometimes your out-of-pocket really has to do with more like getting x-rays or surgeries or, things like that. And it doesn't have much maybe to do with your prescription insurance. That might be a separate part of your policy. If you do need to get it commercially through your insurance, it can take probably, I think the quickest I've ever gotten it is about 10 to 14 days, but it frequently takes 2 to 3 weeks to get that medication to a patient when we decide that we want to start them on this medication. The first thing that we have to do is we have to figure out which of these formulations, the 5 formulations that we have in the US, which one is covered by their insurance company. Frequently what happens is that when I go to write for GCSF, the insurance company says, sure, that's covered. You can have the Zarxio syringe, which is the cheapest syringe. It was the first biosimilar. The problem with the Zarxio syringe, again, if anyone is using it, the GCSF comes in 2 formulations. It comes in a little vial. It looks like a little insulin vial where you draw the medication up, or it comes in a pre-filled syringe. The pre-filled syringes are great for cancer patients because they're usually getting most or a full syringe, and they're usually not getting it for a long period of time. And a lot of times it's even being given in their doctor's office, not even at home. The problem with a lot of the pre-filled syringes is that there are guards on the syringes to help with needle safety. And where those guards are placed, you can't give small doses of the medicine in the syringes. The medicine in the syringes is also twice as concentrated as the medicine in the vials. And so you can give a lower dose from the syringe, which is great, but it also means you can't give very careful or small increments. I have some patients who are on like 0.04 mils or 0.2 mils or something like that of the GCSF, and they're drawing it up into an insulin syringe, like 2 units, 4 units, 20 units. You can't give something like that on the Zarxio syringe. The lowest that you can give is 180 micrograms, which would be 90 or 60 units on an insulin syringe. So that's usually a much bigger dose than most of you are giving for the types of neutropenia that you have when you're giving frequent doses and frequent small doses. And so the insurance company will come back and say, oh, you can have the Zarxio syringe. And then I say, oh, that's great. It's an 8-year-old and I only want to give 6 units, and the lowest I can give there is much more than that. And so then we start this little game of which one will you cover? Will you cover Neupogen? No. Will you cover Nivastim? Sure. Or will you cover Granix or Luco or something like that. And so then once we figure out which one they will cover, then I send a prescription into the insurance company. And sometimes even at that point, even though it's on formulary and it's something they have available, sometimes the insurance will still require what's called a prior authorization and approval for this medicine because it's an expensive medication. And that's when my clinic notes or Dr. Shimura and Dr. Newber's clinic notes or a letter from me, a letter of medical necessity becomes useful and needed. And again, that adds an extra couple of days because you have to write the letter and you send it in and they only look at it like once a day and then they get back to you within 24 to 72 hours. And then hopefully you then get an approval for the medication. Once you get it approved, the family then needs to figure out which specialty pharmacy they want to pick it up at. They need to set up an account with the specialty pharmacy. They have to confirm their insurance with the specialty pharmacy. They need to set up shipment. So again, if you guys are doing this through Niporex, this has all been seamless for you because it's been probably done 5, 10, 20 years ago. But when you're starting a new medication, it can take longer. And then finally, they set up a shipment date. And obviously, as you know, it ships overnight, usually on ice packs. You hopefully have someone there who's going to receive it and put it into the refrigerator as quickly as possible. So that's kind of the process. And so we did have several families run into that during the Neupogen back order. Unfortunately, they didn't have a big supply at home. They really needed it. We weren't hearing from Niporex, or Niporex was saying it's going to be at least 4, 6, 8 weeks, and families didn't have that type of stockpile at home. And so then they had to switch medications. So we did have several people on the registry have to switch to a different GCSF biosimilar, and then they've actually been able to go back. Again, it didn't eliminate that they were on the program. It didn't eliminate that they could get it through the Niporex. It's just that Niporex, if they really literally have no boxes to pull from and ship to you, then they just can't ship it. And they get their boxes directly from Amgen. Amgen earmarks boxes specifically for the registry supply. They ship it to Niporex. Niporex then uses that supply to ship it to families. And Niporex was working very hard whenever they did get boxes, because sometimes their shelves were empty. Whenever they did get boxes, they were going through an order of who had requested a refill and shipping refills out as quickly as they could. Just want to talk a little bit about syringes. How many of you are using an insulin syringe to administer? Would have like a little orange cap. And how many are using, they don't think they're using an insulin syringe. It doesn't have an orange cap, or it's got a, not sure. Okay. So that's something else that we also run into. I think a lot of us who have done GCSF for a long time, especially me, because I'm in children, but honestly, if I had to give myself a shot every day, I would prefer to have a smaller needle and a finer needle than a bigger needle. This is my preference, and I think most people are like that. And so frequently what we use is we use insulin syringes to use these medications, give these medications. Again, the vial looks just like a little insulin vial. It's a little 1 ml vial, and you drop the medicine the same way. But there's some doctors' offices that are uncomfortable with using insulin syringes for a medicine that's not insulin. And the reason for that is that the insulin syringes don't come in milliliters. Most vials or most syringes are in milliliters, but insulin syringes are in what's called units. And the ones that are used for people are 100 units per mil. And so each unit is 0.01 milliliters, a hundredth of a milliliter, which sounds very small. And I have some patients who are on doses of 1 or 2 units. That's how much they're giving. And you can draw it up very accurately with an insulin syringe, which is really nice. But also the needle itself is much finer. It's thinner and finer, and it's shorter than the needles that are not on insulin syringes. And I'm always happy to, again, talk to nurses or talk to people in your programs about this. For me, when I'm talking to my families about their dose, I might say, for instance, your dose is 60 micrograms, and that's 0.2 milliliters, which is 20 units on your insulin syringe. And I put all of that in my notes. Everyone's really clear. So if there's a phone call that comes in, people know the micrograms, which is 3 times the amount of the milliliters, which is equal to the units, but times 100. So 0.2 mils is 20 units, 100, 1 mil is 100 units. So again, we're happy to talk to you about that. Again, there was also some back orders of insulin syringes. I don't know if any of you ran into that, but there was back order of the 6 millimeter insulin syringes were back ordered for a while in the country in the spring. Only the 8 millimeters were available. And so again, we had to kind of work around that. So the thing that's also important about GCSF, which I've already alluded to, is that there's different stabilities for it. The Neupogen, which many of you are on, really can only be stable at room temperature for 1 day. Most families will take the vial out of the fridge for about half an hour before they administer it. I don't know if you're all doing that, but you definitely can do that for more than that, but at least half an hour, because it warms it up so you're not giving a cold injection to yourself or your child. But after a day, that vial at room temperature needs to be thrown away. And we really recommend, because they're single dose vials, that once you use them, you throw them away. You don't continue to use them. There's no preservatives or anything inside that vial. So you really, in general, don't want to be going in and out of the vials. But what's interesting about some of the biosimilars is they have a longer shelf life. So Zarxio, in Europe, it's 8 days. Here, it's 4 days. And I can't quite figure out why that's different, but it's just what's been proven, I guess, for the testing for the FDA. And Granix is 5 days. And so for people who are traveling or travel a lot and don't always have access to refrigeration, which I know if those of you have probably tried to travel with GCSF, it can be challenging depending on where you're going. If you have a refrigerator, or if you have ice, most of us now on a plane can get ice from our flight attendants, or in the airport we can get ice, and they have these great, thermoses now that really keep things cold for quite a while. But again, if you're going for a longer extended vacation, that can be more difficult. And so again, some of these biosimilar products are shelf stable for more days, 4 to 5 days at least, which is really helpful. Not Nivastim. Nivastim and Reluco are not, but Granix and Zarxio are. Any questions about that? So the question was, what about GM-CSF? There is a biosimilar to GM-CSF. So GM-CSF is not something that we use a lot in our patients. Your son's on it. So he's on the biosimilar? Okay. Yep. Yep. Yeah, there's a biosimilar for the GM-CSF as well. Yep. Yeah. There's also long-acting GCSF. I don't know if any of you are on that. It's the pegylated form of GCSF. It's, again, very common in Neulasta. Yeah. Yeah. So it's, again, very common in cancer patients, which is great because they get a course of chemotherapy or radiation, their blood counts drop. You give them a medication that lasts for a while, and then, it stays on board until their blood counts come back up, which works great if you just have one incident where your blood counts drop and then we'll come back up. And then those of you with chronic neutropenias, obviously that's not the issue. And so we usually don't recommend and don't use long-acting GCSF products like Neulasta for patients who have chronic neutropenia. How many of you are on daily doses or give daily doses of GCSF to your children? How many of you are on every 3, like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 3 days a week, or every other day? And is anybody on less than every other day or 3 days a week? Okay. Okay. So things that we tend to think about, and I think the Neutropenia Registry in Seattle had a really great graph of this, which I kept for my own benefit. But it shows that what happens is when you give a little bit of GCS every day, you kind of plateau out what your neutrophil count is, which is great. You don't have the peaks and troughs, right, of having you give a shot and your neutrophil count goes up, and then over the next day or two, it drops. And you give a shot and it goes up, and then it goes back down. And so if you're able to give small doses daily for patients, then you're able to maintain the neutrophil count, the ANC count at a normal range, at a really steady, stable range. You also get rid of a lot of the side effects. And I think for most of my families, the worst side effect of the GCSF, especially at big doses, is bone pain. And for those of you, again, who started maybe with a doctor who did more leukemia and cancer than did, neutropenia, then they might have been tempted to say, oh, let's give you a whole syringe or whole vial, right, of the GCSF. And that makes your neutrophil count go up. It can make your neutrophil count go up really great, but it also can cause a lot of bone pain and a lot of discomfort. And so that's the biggest reason to not do that is, first of all, you get this huge peak, and you don't need your neutrophil count way up here to prevent infections. You just need it down here. And you also don't want all the side effects of the bone pain. So all of our patients, we start on daily GCSF, and then if they have really good counts and we can get them down to a fairly low dose, sometimes we'll try to space them out to every other day. I feel like most families find every other day really hard to remember, right? Because it's Monday one week and Tuesday the next week and then Monday the next week. A lot of my families will just do it that they always give it on odds or even days. That's just how they do it. And they know sometimes you're going to be the 31st of the month and the 1st of the month, and then you're just going to have to do 2 days in a row, but otherwise you just do the odds or evens. And that tends to work for a lot of families. A lot of our patients will end up on Monday, Wednesday, Friday dosing. And very rarely do I have kids on less than that, like a Monday, Thursday dosing. And as Dr. Dale said, what's really important is when you do check your blood counts, and most patients on GCSF are recommending at least twice a year, if not 2 or 3 times a year, that you're checking a blood count to make sure that you're on the right dose, right? You want to make sure that you draw that lab as soon as you can before the dose. So as far from your last dose and as soon as possible before your dose. So if you're giving it every day, it's great to get it just before your next dose. But say you're doing it Monday, Wednesday, Friday, then what we'd ask is that you draw it on Monday before your dose, because Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday is the longest time that you're not on GCSF. And we want to know just before you give your shot, are you still covered and protected? Did that dose from Friday still cover and protect you? Or do we need to do some tweaking on the dose or on the frequency that you're getting your shot? So that's something to be thinking about. I know some families or some patients have been like on GCSF literally for 20, 30 years, and they feel very confident that their blood counts are good on those doses. But again, I recommend at least once or twice a year that you get a blood count and make sure that everything is going okay. I talked about formulations. I talked about syringes. So I think the other thing I just wanted to think about with GCSF is rotating sites. How many of you give your shot in the same place, or you give it to your child in the same place? Like always arms or always legs, or I mean, I think sometimes, mostly with kids, but I think there's some adults who feel that way too. I know a lot of adults don't like injecting in their stomach, and your stomach actually is a really nice, big, beautiful area to do GCSF shots in. Most of us have a little bit padding there. It's easy to see. It's really hard to do the back of your arm yourself. I think I'd be challenged by that. It's easier to have someone else do it in the back of your arm or your legs, but we do encourage you to rotate sites. That's really important. Even though most of you are giving fairly small doses, over time you can get some scarring or fibrosis, thickening of your skin. So we really encourage you to rotate sites if you can. And a lot of my families will put a Band-Aid on when they did it. If they're rotating legs or rotating arms, they just leave the Band-Aid on until the next shot. So they're like, okay, I have a Band-Aid on the right arm. I'll give it on the left arm, take that Band-Aid off, put a new Band-Aid on. Or some people just know, my right arm is Monday, my left arm is Wednesday, my leg, is Friday, or whatever that they're going to do to monitor their sites. That's mostly what I wanted to talk about. Does anybody have any other questions about biosimilars or GCSF? Yeah. So again, the Zarxia and the Granix are shelf stable for room temperature. They don't have to be refrigerated for 4 to 5 days. The thing is, if you're on a formulation, your doctors usually aren't going to let you just pick up Granix to go on like a trip to Europe or something like that. So most of the time you can't just switch back and forth, because usually your insurance company will have a preferred formulation, and you have a prescription for it. So I was just saying that if you are on one of these other formulations, then it does have that added benefit of being able to travel a little bit more easily with it than the Neupogen. But yeah, it's most families can't just say, oh, I want to get Zarxia or Granix just because I'm going away for a few weeks, unfortunately. Peter? Did you have a comment, Peter? Sorry. Oh, Dr. Newberger was talking about dividing doses, like if you're drawing up a large volume. I don't know how many of you are drawing up a large volume more than a milliliter. Is anyone doing that more than a full vial or full syringe? It's more common in cancer treatments, I think, than in most of our neutropenia patients. But if you're doing large volumes, instead of putting it all in one spot, and you can give a fairly large sub-Q volume in one site, but if you are giving large volumes, you can divide the dose. You can draw half the dose up into one syringe and give it in one arm and draw the other half up in another arm. I've not had to do that with pediatric patients, so I'm not sure if it's really more common with adult patients. I do just want to put a plug in again for the fact that these really are single dose vials, but I know that sometimes people are stressed about that or are pressured to not have them be single dose. So the things that I want you to think about, if you're not going to follow the instructions, the manufacturer instructions, which is single dose, you use it once and you throw it away. And I know that feels incredibly wasteful. I understand that. You've got a vial that's $200 and you're drawing up like not even a fifth of it maybe, and then you're just throwing it away, and it feels very wrong. Those of you on the Neupogen Amgen program, you should hopefully not be having significant side effects or anxiety about that because it's being provided to you. Those of you who I know are paying out of pocket, feel like if I didn't do that, maybe my drug could last longer. I'd have less copays. I would have less shipments. I have one mom who said, I am storing up for the zombie apocalypse. I just don't trust anymore that I'm going to always have a supply. And so in the back of my fridge, I keep a little supply. And then, I use, oldest to newest is kind of what I do. And then she found out 2 or 3 months ago that she had not kept a close eye on her supply. And it was over a year old and it was expired. And then her husband did not know about the zombie apocalypse and that he was supposed to be drawing certain vials. And he had been giving expired vials to her son. And so she's like, okay, maybe that wasn't the best plan. But if you are tempted or feeling in need that you need to, for some reason, use a vial more than once, what we ask is that you, again, very carefully clean it off with alcohol before you go into the vial each time. And that you draw them up all at once. So rather than drop one dose, stick it in the fridge, and then come back to it 2, 3, 4 days later and drop another dose, draw up both your doses at the same time. So clean off the vial, drop your dose, give it, clean off the vial, drop your dose that you are saving or banking because you really, for some reason, have to do that, and cap it very, very carefully, especially the insulin syringes are very sharp and you can go right through that little orange cap if you recap it. So super, super careful if you're going to do this. And then you put the capped syringe in the fridge. So you're not then drawing up again from the vials. So again, I'm going to be here through tomorrow. I'm happy to chat with you about GCSF or anything else with your neutropenia journeys as far as health and staying well and food and travel. And I know there's comments about neutropenia diets and all those types of things. So please come find me. And if we don't hook up today, then I'm always available by phone. We can set up a Zoom call. I'm also available nights and evenings. And sometimes that's more easy for families who have kids or are working to have conversations like that. Finally, a last plug that I do have consent forms here for those of you who aren't on the registry or those of you who were on the registry through Seattle but haven't reconsented in Boston. We really encourage you to do that. I'm happy to meet with you and go through the consent form with you now. We have it on paper, or again, set up a time that we can do it virtually by a Zoom call. So yeah, so currently it's just once a year that we're having families send us samples, especially blood samples. So it's not every single time you get a blood count that we are asking you to share blood. If you're having a bone marrow, it's really helpful to pair the blood and bone marrow sample at the same time. And I think Dr. Shimmer will be talking about that a little bit more. But if it's just a blood sample, then it's just a one-time blood. It's a blood sample once a year. And we can, again, send a kit to you. I will caution that most doctor's office and hospitals are very happy to collect these types of samples for us. If you're going to a commercial lab like a Quest or LabCorp, they frequently do not have policies in place to allow them to draw blood for a research test and then hand it to you even though you're going to take it and ship it back yourself. They actually don't have that as part of their policies to do that. So frequently a Quest or LabCorp will not do that, whereas a doctor's office or a hospital lab usually will do that for you. And we're happy to talk to you about that more. We have a kit that we send out overnight to you. So you have the kit and all the instructions, the tubes, the mailer, or again, if you're going to your doctor's office, they have the tubes and we can send them the label. At 4 o'clock,